Finally began our journey into maternity nursing. Today we're going to talk about fetal development. And I want to start by saying that the reason it's important for nurses to study fetal development is because it helps to screen for risks in a pregnancy. It helps for prevention and detection of complications, for prophylaxis and that continued surveillance through the pregnancy, and also for educating parents of the fetus. So starting with our cellular processes, remember that the cells are the building blocks of all organs. There are two types of cells, soma cells and gametes. Soma cells are the cells that make up our organs and tissues. They have a nucleus containing 23 pairs of chromosomes. 22 of those are autosomes. These are our chromosomes that determine our genetic traits, like our hair color and our eyes. And then one pair of sex chromosomes, which determines gender. Chromosomes are composed of genes, and these genes and chromosomes are what control our hereditary traits. Then we have our gametes, or our germ cell or sex cells. These are only found in the reproductive glands, so the ovaries or the testes. In the female, the gamete is called an ovum. In the male, the gamete is called spermatozoon or sperm. Each of these gametes has 23 chromosomes. In the stages of fetal development, the three stages that we talk about are the pre-embryonic, embryonic, and fetal stages. The pre-embryonic stage begins at fertilization and it lasts for 2 weeks. Cellular division and implantation usually occur during this stage. Conception usually happens when the ovum is in the ampulla, which is the outermost half of the fallopian tube. So if you look at this, you know, the uterus is over here. That is not what a uterus looks like, but anyway, you get the idea. The uterus is over here. So this is our ovary, and ovary is where we have all the little ovum. So as the ovum leaves and heads into the fallopian tube, it's right around this area usually that the sperm and the ovum meet up, and fertilization happens within this space typically. And then it'll proceed, the fertilized ovum will proceed down into the uterus, where hopefully implantation will occur. In this pre-embryonic stage, a zygote is formed, and it has a diploid number of chromosomes. So when we say diploid, we're talking about 2 sets, so a total of 46. Gender determination occurs at the time of fertilization, and it is dependent on whether a sperm has an X or Y chromosome. According to research, there's approximately a 50-50 chance of either occurrence. So if you remember, the female has the X and the X, and the male has the X and the Y. So when we're talking haploid and diploid, haploid is the sperm, you know, there's 26 chromosomes, 23 chromosomes. I got 46 on my brain. And then in the egg, there's 23. Then they get together and make a diploid zygote, which ideally has 46 chromosomes. Implantation, by the 10th day after fertilization, that blastocyst gets buried into the uterine lining. Blastocyst is the name for that fertilized group of cells. This is when the mother's hormones, she'll begin to produce the human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. This is the hormone that they look for in pregnancy tests to determine if a mother is pregnant. Usually at this point, the mom has not missed her menstrual cycle, so she's usually unaware at this point that she's even pregnant. Now moving into the embryonic stage. The embryonic stage lasts from the end of the 2nd week post-fertilization until the end of the 8th week. The developing conceptus becomes an embryo at this point. Differentiation begins. So this is when the cells of that embryo will multiply, and then the tissues begin to assume their specific functions. That's pretty amazing that this happens at such an early stage. In that 3rd week, those germ layers develop. There's 3 germ layers. There's a table 5-2 in your text that will show you this, but I think I got a picture of it here on the next slide. It's page 93, sorry. So these germ layers are the layers that will become our different organs and tissues. So if you look here, there are names of these layers: the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. So the ectoderm is the outer layer of the cells. So if you look over here, here's our ectoderm. This forms our skin, hair, nails, and the nervous system. So the brain and spinal cord come from that ectoderm. Important stuff to know. The mesoderm is that middle layer, so that's this layer in here. The mesoderm forms our skeletal, muscular, and circulatory systems. So muscle, bones, heart, and kidney come from the mesoderm. And then the endoderm is that inner layer. The endoderm here, sorry, the little yellow piece. The endoderm forms our glands, our lungs, the urinary system, and the digestive tract. So endoderm, internal organs. You want to remember those layers. In the fetal stage happens from the beginning of the 9th week after fertilization and then continues on until birth. So this is when we are dealing with a fetus. So starting with beginning of 9th week until birth. So during this stage, additional growth and maturation of the organs and body systems occurs. At this stage, the fetus is usually about 50 millimeters and weighs about 8 grams. And then by the end, when it's time to be born, they're usually about 36 centimeters and they weigh about 3,400 grams. There are fetal membranes. The amniotic cavity, this begins to develop around 9 days post-conception. This is the area where the fetus grows, and it's surrounded by the amnion. And there is a picture coming up. Don't worry, you'll be able to look at that. So the amnion is a thick fibrous lining. It's composed of several layers. This is protection for the fetus. This also forms the inner part of that sac in which the fetus grows. Then we have the chorion. This is a second layer of thick fibrous tissue, and that surrounds the amnion. So you can see why this baby's so protected. There's layer upon layer upon layer. By the end of the 2nd week post-fertilization, you'll get these chorionic villi. These form a arterial and capillary and venous network, which is what eventually becomes the fetal blood vessels. So here's a little picture here. Here you can see on this end here is our placenta, and then you can see your layers here. You have your amnion and then your chorion out here. That is serves as protection for our baby. So amniotic fluid is what is filled inside that sac. It helps that baby to be able to move around. The 4 main functions that you should know about amniotic fluid is that it provides physical protection because it cushions the fetus. You can imagine mom's moving around, and if she gets bumped into something, that baby will just kind of swoosh around in there and not get injured, hopefully. It also serves for temperature regulation because fetuses do not have the ability to regulate their own temperature. It allows for provision of unrestricted movement, so the baby can move around, kick, and get a little bit of exercise in there, which will help them as they develop. It also allows for symmetrical growth. So if you could imagine if the baby was, didn't have that fluid and they were stuck in one position, maybe if their little arm was stuck underneath them or something and they couldn't like swish and move out of the way, that arm might not develop equally like the other arm because it hasn't been able to reposition itself. So think about that. Within the amniotic fluid, the infant or the fetus will actually breathe it in. It's not really breathing like you and I breathe, but they do take it in. They'll drink, they'll urinate, everything in that amniotic fluid. So amniotic fluid is produced from maternal blood, fetal urine, and fetal respiratory tract secretions, but 98 to 99% of it is water. Then we have the placenta. The placenta is the organ that sustains, nourishes, and nourishes a growing pregnancy. It serves three main functions. One, to provide for transfer and exchange of substances. It also acts as a barrier for certain substances, so it'll filter out things. And it functions as an endocrine gland, which helps produce hormones for the baby and the mother. The placenta begins to develop during the 5th week after fertilization, and it develops at the site of implantation. So wherever that fertilized ovum decided to burrow and bury and become a blastocyst, that's where the placenta will form and attach itself to the inside of the womb. The placenta transfers nutrients like oxygen, glucose. It also helps remove waste products like carbon dioxide and urea. So that placenta is a super important piece here. This is what gives that baby life in there. So maternal blood is very rich in oxygen and nutrients that reaches the placenta at the level of the intervillous spaces that are surrounded by those chorionic villi, and you'll see that here in the next picture. Those chorionic villi contain those fetal blood vessels that we talked about. The exchange of nutrients for waste occurs by simple diffusion or active transport across a thin membrane that separates the fetal and maternal bloodstreams. So just like any other cells, that diffusion and transport happens there. So this is also where that fetus receives passive immunity from mom. Those maternal antibodies for like diphtheria, smallpox, measles, they travel across that placenta. What doesn't travel across there are things like CMV or cytomegalovirus, varicella, and rubella. So if they become exposed, baby can get an infection from that, and it can be actually devastating for the pregnancy. So you always want to use caution with medications because some medications will cross through there as well. The placenta also secretes progesterone, estrogen, and HCG. So here's a picture of the placenta. You can see you have all the little veins. So this is all from the maternal circulation, and these are the intervillous spaces, all that exchange happens, and then everything goes up and then forms what we know as the umbilical cord. It's a pretty miraculous thing. I had to add this picture because it's just a beautiful baby, but it's just a beautiful image here of what that looks like. So this placenta here lives inside with that newborn and gives it life. You see why they call it the tree of life. I think it's so pretty. Okay, so the umbilical cord then extends from the fetal umbilicus, so from that belly button, to the fetal surface of the placenta. So going back to look at that, it extends from here. This is the fetal surface of the placenta. So this piece that you see here is what's on the inside. The opposite side, this side out here, is what sits up against the inside of the mother's uterus. An umbilical cord has ideally 2 arteries that bring deoxygenated blood from the fetus. So this is a little backwards of what we know about veins and arteries. So arteries in the umbilical cord bring the deoxygenated blood from the fetus to the placenta, and then there's one vein carrying oxygenated and nourished blood from the placenta to the fetus. Surrounding these is a clear gelatinous substance that helps support the cord and keep it from getting compressed. So if you can imagine that cord in there, if it didn't have any of that slippery kind of slimy jelly around it, it would easily maybe stick on itself. I always imagine it like a spaghetti noodle or something that maybe you've taken it out of the water and now you're messing with it, and you know how it kind of sticks on itself. So without that oil, without that jelly, it can get tangled up very easily. It can get compressed very easily. So that's called Wharton jelly. Now talking about fetal circulation, I am going to post an extra video that I like on fetal circulation that I want you to review. There is low oxygen tension in the fetal circulation. The 3 shunts that are important for you to remember in the fetal circulation are the ductus venosus, This is a duct between the two veins that go into the inferior vena cava to the right atrium. The ductus venosus, half of it feeds into the liver, the other half bypasses it. That's what the ductus venosus does. It's kind of like a tollway, I guess you will, if you will, around that, and you'll see here in a little bit. We also have the foramen ovale. This connects the right and left atria. This allows for quick passage of oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart to the brain. And then we have the ductus arteriosus. This allows for oxygenated blood to flow to the body without having to enter the heart. So these are all things just, they're like I said, kind of like tollways, just to go ahead and make traveling throughout the fetal circulation a little bit more efficient. We'll see, I'll show you later that after birth, these things, the ductus venosus, ductus arteriosus, they will close up. The foramen ovale, it'll close up, and then it'll be more like the adult circulation. In placental circulation, all that exchange occurs in those intervillous spaces that we talked about when I showed you the picture of the placenta there. Some things to think about, sometimes these shunts don't close when the baby is born, so this is usually like in premature babies. Eventually they usually outgrow it, but if not, they would have to have some type of intervention to close those up because we don't want them open. So this is kind of a little graph that I put together to help you remember the pathway in which the fetal circulation happens. So from the placenta, the red meaning that the blood is oxygenated. So oxygenated blood goes from the placenta into the umbilical vein, and then in through the ductus venosus, which again bypasses the liver circulation. Only 50% of that blood goes there. And then it goes into the right atrium by way of the inferior vena cava. It'll then mix with deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, and that's why these arrows here are purple. So this is a blend of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. It's then pumped through either the foramen ovale or the right ventricle and the ductus arteriosus, allowing it to the right heart to bypass the pulmonary circulation. So we don't really need to go there into the lungs because that's not where that gas exchange is happening like it does in an adult. And then that mix of blood goes into the left heart. The left side of the heart then contracts, and that mixed blood flows from the left atrium to the left ventricle, into the aorta, and through normal circulation. Then it takes that deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, that enters the right atrium, goes into the right ventricle, and then normally at this point from the right ventricle it would normally go to the pulmonary circulation, but instead it goes back into circulation via the ductus arteriosus into the umbilical arteries and gets returned to the placenta for gas exchange. This sounds like a lot, and it is. Sometimes it's very hard to grasp, but I wanted to put it in a different perspective for you so that you could see it in another way. But once you see the video, once you look at the pictures and kind of try to follow this pathway, it'll start to make a little bit more sense. So here is just a picture of what the fetal circulation looks like. So if you imagine the placenta is over here, this is where that oxygenated blood is coming from, and then you can see here's our liver, right? So we have our ductus venosus, which 50% of the blood's going to go here and supply the liver, but this ductus here, it's that tollway that I was talking about that helps bypass. So that's called the ductus venosus. That helps to get that blood up here to the heart a little bit faster. Then here we have the right side of our heart, the baby's heart. Here's our foramen ovale. That's this hole there between the right and left atrium. And then from there you can follow the circulation. It all kind of goes around there. Our ductus arteriosus is this little piece up in here. So it it exchanges things both ways. Instead, normally when we're an adult, that closes off and you have the separation between the aorta and what other structures here? I can't see because now I drew all over it. Anyway, so that'll close off just so that blood doesn't mix anymore, ideally. If it doesn't, then we end up with babies who are a little bit blue when they come out, but that can be fixed, and it usually fixes itself as they mature. All right, so some special considerations of fetal development. Teratogens in the fetus. So teratogens are substances that can cause birth defects. The severity of the defect depends upon when during fetal development that fetus or conceptus was exposed to that teratogen. So this is why it's important to know like what's developing at what stage. So maybe if the heart has already developed and they get exposed to something, it won't necessarily affect the heart, but it might affect, something else that gets developed after that. So it all depends on which body systems are developing at the time that the baby or the mother is exposed to that. And it also depends on the particular teratogenic agent to which the fetus is exposed. So, on table 5-4 on page 101. Let me see what I have here. 101 has some common teratogens and their associated effects. So you want to look at that. Also table 5-4 and 5-5 you need to look at. This 5-4 will tell you during which week of development, if they're exposed, what structures are commonly affected by that. In that pre-embryonic stage, exposure has an all or nothing effect. And then the greatest damaging effects will occur during the embryonic stage. So some types of teratogenic agents, ingested agents. So these might be prescriptions or over-the-counter medications, illicit drugs and alcohol. If anybody's familiar with like tetracycline, things like that, this is why they ask, is there any chance that you could be pregnant? Because we don't want to expose the baby to those because we know they have known teratogenic effects. So you should always look that up too in your drug guide. That's important to know. Even if the woman doesn't think she's pregnant, if she's of age that she could be, then it's always important to ask. Another type of teratogenic agent could be like an infectious agent. So things like varicella, CMV, and rubella, but also cat feces. Cat feces is very dangerous for pregnancy because of toxoplasmosis. It's a parasite that lives in cat feces and kitty litter. So if the mother is pregnant, it's always good to free her of kitty litter duty. You can also have environmental substances, so ionizing x-rays. That's why they always ask before a woman has an x-ray if there's any chance she could be pregnant. We wear the gown to protect the fetus just in case. Any other radioactive substances, and also there's certain chemicals as well. An ectopic pregnancy is when the zygote implants in places other than the uterus. So sometimes it doesn't quite make it to the uterus and it might try to implant within that fallopian tube. 95% of them, ectopic pregnancies will occur in the fallopian tube, and it is usually caused by some type of blockage or scarring of the tubes, which can be from infection or trauma or things like endometriosis, anything like that. If this can occur in 1 to 2% of all pregnancies, some people have them and don't even realize they have them, but in a more severe case, it can actually rupture the fallopian tube, and that becomes an emergency. We can also have multi-fetal pregnancies. So you can have twins, you can have triplets, goes on and on, 8 of them. So monozygotic twins are identical twins. These are derived from one zygote. So one zygote splits, makes 2 babies. They share the same genetic material, and identical twins are always the same sex. Dizygotic twins or fraternal twins develop from separate egg and sperm fertilizations. Their genetic material is not identical, and they may or may not be the same sex. Some contributing factors for multifetal pregnancies: family history of twins. If a woman was recently on oral contraceptives and got pregnant right away, sometimes it just messes with the hormones, so it can cause her to release more than one ovum. Women who are taller or larger stature are more likely to have multifetal pregnancies. Women of African American heritage are at greater risk as well. And then the use of fertility medications, because also those can cause the increase in hormones, the change in hormones can cause a woman to release more than one ovum. All right, so that concludes the fetal development. Again, go look for the fetal heart circulation video. I'm going to post it. Don't stress out about this. It can be very confusing, but we're going to get through it. I'm going to teach you about it because you need to know. All right.